the separation that saved your soul. There comes a moment in every believer's life when heaven intervenes in silence, not with a trumpet, not with a voice from the clouds, but with a quiet shift. A door closes, a chapter ends, and someone who once held your heart is removed from your life. To the untrained eye, it looks like heartbreak, but to the spirit that walks with God, it is rescue in disguise. When God separated you from the narcissist, it wasn't a loss, it was a deliverance, a divine redirection. You didn't just escape emotional abuse, you were snatched from a fire that had been quietly consuming your soul. And though it hurt, and though you may have wept, heaven was rejoicing because that moment marked the beginning of your restoration and the unraveling of the narcissist's illusion of control. This is the story of what happens when God says enough and breaks the chain of manipulation. It is the story of how your obedience to his separation shattered the ego of the one who thought they owned you. The separation of God is a divine rescue, not a rejection. There are seasons in life when the most painful events are not punishments, but divine operations of grace. They are not signs of God's absence, but evidence of his deeper involvement, working behind the scenes to untangle you from what you thought was love, but was in truth bondage dressed in beauty. And perhaps no moment proves this more profoundly than when God separates you from someone you once trusted, once loved, and once believed would be part of your forever. You must understand, when God separated you from the narcissist, he didn't do so casually, he didn't do it recklessly. He did it as a physician cuts away infection to save the body. He did it the way a shepherd pulls a sheep from the mouth of a predator, not because the sheep is weak, but because it is worthy of saving. You were in the arms of someone who praised you with words but consumed you in spirit, someone who mirrored your goodness only to manipulate your kindness. And slowly, so slowly you may not have noticed, you began to disappear within their narrative. You adjusted your light so they could shine. You questioned your needs so theirs could be met. You excused red flags and called them challenges, but in your heart you felt it. Something holy inside you was shrinking. It is the peculiar genius of a narcissist to make you believe that your decline is your fault, that their disrespect is your consequence, that their emotional starvation is your doing. And in this sinister twisting of reality, you become both the caretaker and the captive, and still you stay. You stay because you love, because you believe, because the image of who they were in the beginning is a ghost you keep chasing in the hopes it might return. But it won't. It was never real. And so God, in his unshakable mercy, intervenes. Not always with thunder, not always with visible miracles. Sometimes the divine intervention is simply a breaking point, a moment so heavy, so unmanageable, so holy in its sorrow that you finally let go. And in that surrender, God does what you could not. He separates, but here is the mystery we often miss. God doesn't just separate physically, he separates spiritually. He severs the invisible soul tie that kept you tethered to a counterfeit covenant. He reclaims his child. He says, as he did in Isaiah 52:11, "Depart, depart, go out from there. Touch no unclean thing. Come out from it and be pure, you who carry the vessels of the Lord." What a declaration! What a charge! God does not beg you to stay in what breaks you. He commands you to come out. And when he speaks, walls crumble. When he calls, chains fall. It is a painful paradox that the very moment we interpret as rejection is the one heaven labels as rescue. You may have wept in your car, you may have stared at empty messages wondering why they stopped chasing you. You may have begged God for a reason, a sign, a reconciliation, but he answered you already, in the silence, in the separation, in the divine untying of a bond that was never blessed. God does not remove people from your life to hurt you. He removes people to heal you. He saw the emotional erosion, the quiet spiritual disfigurement, the way your gifts were being exploited rather than honored. And so he said, "No more." He closed the door, not out of anger, but out of compassion, because you had forgotten your worth. You had compromised your calling. You were living below the dignity of one who bears his image. Do not romanticize what God had to rescue you from. Do not grieve over what heaven had to confront. There is nothing holy about holding on to a soul-draining bond out of fear or nostalgia. You are not called to be a hostage to someone else's ego. You are called to be whole. And now that you are out, you may look back and wonder why they reacted the way they did. You may be shocked at the rage, the coldness, the denial. But this is where revelation begins. The narcissist didn't lose someone they loved. They lost someone they controlled. And that loss is not felt in the heart. It is felt in the ego. Which leads us to the next revelation. Narcissists don't mourn you. They mourn their loss of power. To the healed heart, love is a sacred connection. It is selfless, patient, and protective. But to the narcissist, love is currency, a tool of control masquerading as affection. And so when God separated you from them, you may have expected mourning, you may have imagined regret, reflection, or at least some flicker of remorse, but instead what you saw, perhaps what you're still seeing, is rage, dismissiveness, blame-shifting, indifference, or even worse, replacement. Why? Because what the narcissist mourns is not you as a person. They mourn what your presence provided to their ego. You were their reflection, their emotional cushion, their enabler. You brought order to their chaos, affirmation to their arrogance, and structure to their spiritual emptiness. And now, with you gone, they are not grieving love lost. They are unraveling under a collapse of power they once held so tightly. You did not simply walk away. You disrupted their control system. This is why they seem so emotionally unaffected on the surface. The narcissist is not built for introspection. Their entire self-concept is a fortress constructed to avoid vulnerability. To them, losing control over someone is far more threatening than losing love, because love requires the one thing they cannot tolerate: mutuality. True love asks for equality, but narcissists demand hierarchy. They don't want a partner, they want a subordinate. And when you stopped bowing, when you stopped justifying, when you finally walked through the door that God opened, you became dangerous. Not because you harmed them, but because you saw them for who they truly are. It was not your rejection that broke them, it was your clarity. And so, in their world, you must be rewritten. You must become the villain in their story, the betrayer, the crazy one. Because acknowledging your worth would be acknowledging their abuse. And narcissistic ego cannot survive in the presence of truth. They would rather destroy your reputation than confront their own reflection. But here's the beauty of divine separation. You no longer have to live under their narrative. God is writing a new one. He is rewriting your identity in ink that cannot be erased by manipulation. You are no longer a chapter in their fantasy. You are the protagonist in your own redemption story. It is tempting to believe that their coldness means they didn't care. But that's not the truth. They cared, but only for what you provided to their sense of self. They needed your loyalty, your empathy, your stability. You were the structure upon which their dysfunction leaned. And when you were removed, that structure collapsed. But even that collapse didn't begin with sorrow. It began with confusion and fury, because in their mind, you weren't supposed to leave. You were supposed to stay. You were supposed to keep giving, keep tolerating, keep explaining, keep rescuing. The idea that you could choose freedom, that God could call you out, was a direct assault on their illusion of control. This is why your silence enrages them. This is why your healing triggers them. Because your very peace is proof that they no longer own a piece of you. And for someone whose identity is built on possession and performance, that peace becomes unbearable. They may pretend to move on, they may even flaunt a new relationship, but make no mistake, they are not moving forward. They are searching for another reflection, another version of you, another soul to mirror what they cannot hold inside themselves. But none of it will satisfy, because what they lost in you was not just attention, it was authority. And that loss of power begins the slow, silent cracking of their identity. If you've felt this shift in your soul, if you've seen their reaction and finally understood it was never about love but control, comment below, God broke the chains. Which leads us to a deeper and far more devastating truth. Without you, the narcissist's false identity begins to collapse. The narcissist's entire world is built on illusion, and you were one of the pillars holding it up. Not because you agreed with their lies, but because your presence, your attention, your empathy, your quiet strength gave shape to the false self they had constructed over years of spiritual denial and emotional dysfunction. Like a building made of mirrors, their identity depends not on what is true, but on what appears to be. They do not exist in the reality of their own soul, because that soul is fractured, empty, and terrified. Instead, they project a grand version of themselves, woven together by borrowed reflections and carefully curated moments. And the tragedy is this: they believe the illusion even as it devours them. When God separated you, He didn't just remove a partner from a relationship. He removed oxygen from a fire. Your withdrawal wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. It disrupted their ability to maintain the fantasy. Because while they may have pretended to be strong, charming, self-assured, or even godly, the truth is that they needed you to keep that act alive. Your reactions, your validation, even your pain, it all served to reinforce their imagined greatness. You were the echo chamber in which their ego resounded. But when you left, the echo died. And in that silence, the illusion began to unravel. Narcissists cannot sustain themselves apart from others. They require constant reinforcement. People to adore them, to fear them, to revolve around them. Without an audience, the performance collapses. Without a mirror, they lose form. The narcissist's sense of self is so fragile, so artificially maintained, that even a single act of defiance, especially divine defiance, can undo years of psychological manipulation. When God removed you from the equation itself stopped working. The persona they spent years perfecting no longer produced the same results. Others didn't respond to them the way you once did. They weren't as admired. They weren't as in control. And worse, they started to feel it. The weight of their own emptiness, the unbearable silence that your soul once filled, it grew louder by the day. And here lies the terrifying truth: the narcissist does not know who they are without someone else supplying them with identity. They are like a shadow that cannot exist without light, and for a long time you were that light, perhaps too bright, too consistent, too forgiving. But your light was never meant to serve as their source. It was meant to reflect the image of God within you, not sustain the broken shell of someone unwilling to seek healing. The more they consumed you, the more distorted they became. And when God said enough, it was not just about your survival. It was about exposing their delusion. Now they are left with what they truly are: not gods, not leaders, not irreplaceable figures, but deeply broken individuals who have spent so long pretending to be powerful that they no longer know how to be human. They search for new supply, new reflection, new people to manipulate, but nothing fits, nothing satisfies, because what they had in you was not just attention, it was covering. And that covering, once removed by God Himself, cannot be substituted by counterfeit. They try to replicate the image you once provided, but it flickers, it fails, Because what made you unique was not your compliance, it was your spirit, and that spirit was never theirs to possess. So their identity begins to cave in, not because you cursed them, but because the scaffolding of falsehood was only ever sustained by your truth. Your goodness held them up. Your faith covered their lack. Your discernment protected them more than they knew. And now, with God's hand having removed you, there is no spiritual insulation left. The cracks begin to show. The mask becomes heavy. The lies no longer land. And the pressure to keep pretending becomes unbearable. But the collapse of the narcissist's identity is not merely emotional, it is spiritual. What you left behind is not just a person in pain, but a soul exposed to divine truth. And when truth enters a space built on lies, it does not negotiate. It dismantles. That, in turn, brings us to the next level of consequence, one they cannot avoid, and one that God Himself begins to orchestrate in full. The spiritual unraveling of the narcissist as judgment takes its place where manipulation once ruled. Their downfall isn't just emotional, it's spiritual. To the carnal mind, the downfall of a narcissist looks like a string of failed relationships, angry outbursts, reckless decisions, and cycles of self-destruction. But to the discerning heart, to the one who sees with the eyes of the Spirit, there is something far deeper unfolding beneath the surface. What looks like confusion and dysfunction is, in truth, a judgment in motion, not the wrathful strike of an angry God, but the quiet, unrelenting unveiling of truth. Truth that the narcissist has run from their entire life. You see, narcissism is not merely a personality issue. It is a spiritual condition, a rebellion against the order of creation. It is the exaltation of self above all else, the demand to be worshipped without being accountable, to be praised without being humble, to be served without ever serving. This is not simply emotional immaturity. It is a spiritual arrogance, a form of idolatry, where the narcissist places themselves on the throne of their own life and expects others to orbit around their self-declared greatness. And yet there is only one true throne, and there is only one worthy of worship. God does not share His glory, not because He is insecure, but because He is holy. And when a narcissist persists in demanding worship from others while denying accountability to heaven, they do not just offend people, they provoke the judgment of the Almighty. That judgment is not always instant, but it is inevitable, because what the narcissist touches, they corrupt. When God separates a person from a narcissist, it is often the first act in a divine sequence. First comes removal, then comes exposure, then comes unraveling, not by your hands, but by His. Because once the covering of the anointed is lifted, once the grace you unknowingly extended is withdrawn, the narcissist is left to stand on their own spiritual foundation, and that foundation is cracked, hollow, and unable to bear weight. They begin to stumble, not just relationally or emotionally, but in the unseen places where pride once stood unchallenged. The Word declares in Proverbs 16:18, "Pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall." And this is not poetic exaggeration, it is divine law. No soul can exalt itself indefinitely without facing consequence. No person can suppress the voice of conviction forever without being pierced by it in the end. And though the narcissist has spent years silencing truth, rejecting correction, and dismissing the warnings of those who love them, they cannot silence the voice of God. And when that voice begins to speak, not in mercy but in exposure, the narcissist's carefully constructed world begins to fracture. This fracture does not look like justice to the world, it looks like chaos. They begin to spiral, financially, emotionally, spiritually. Their connections dry up, their patterns intensify, their ability to manipulate no longer bears fruit, and the people they once deceived start seeing clearly. The platform they stood on becomes unstable. The charm that once opened doors begins to repulse. What was once tolerated is now called out. It's not just misfortune, it is heaven's reckoning. But here's the most terrifying part for them. It isn't loud. It isn't immediate. It is slow. It is suffocating. It is tailored perfectly to reach their core, because God, in His justice, knows exactly how to bring down every stronghold, not to annihilate the person, but to destroy the lie. And when the lie has been worshipped for too long, the collapse of that lie feels like the end of the world. They no longer trust anyone because everyone has stopped playing along. They no longer feel safe because the illusions they created to shield themselves are full of holes. They no longer feel powerful because God has begun to strip them of what they never rightfully owned. Your soul, your voice, your light. In the realm of the spirit, they are standing exposed. The demons they once used to project strength now devour them from within. The false wisdom they weaponized becomes confusion in their own mind. The mask they wore for so long begins to disintegrate, and what is left behind is not the God they pretended to be, but the wounded, immature, unrepentant soul they refused to confront. And now they must face that soul, not in your presence, not with your comfort, but in the full gaze of a holy God who will not be mocked. You may never see the full extent of this fall with your eyes, but trust this, God is not mocked. What they sowed into your life, deception, dishonor, control, they now reap in their own. But more than that, they reap what they sowed into His design, His image, His justice. And the justice of God is perfect. It doesn't always punish in public, but it always confronts in private. It doesn't always roar, but it never relents. And as they descend into the consequences of their deception, something far more beautiful and holy begins to rise in you, a new identity, a healed soul, a story of resurrection. Because while they stumble, God is doing something greater in you. And that brings us to the next divine truth, that your healing is not just recovery. It is the radiant proof that God has begun a new creation in you. The separation was the beginning of their unraveling, but the beginning of your becoming. What the narcissist did not foresee, what they could never predict, was that the very act of trying to break you would lead to their own undoing. When they lost access to your life, your voice, your warmth, your prayer covering, and your unconditional presence, they assumed they were simply discarding a source of comfort. They believed that you would grieve, that you would return, that you would collapse under the weight of their absence. But instead, God stepped in, and what began as separation became the beginning of a resurrection, not theirs, but yours. Because your story was never going to end in destruction. You were never meant to be buried beneath someone else's dysfunction. That pain you endured, the gaslighting, the soul erasure, the dehumanization, it was not your grave, it was your womb. God was not burying you, He was planting you, and what they mistook for your end was actually the divine beginning of your becoming. They were trying to define you by your brokenness, but God was refining you through that very fire. The fire didn't consume you, it purified you. It burned away false narratives, codependency, fear of rejection, and the desperate need to be enough for someone who could never be satisfied. It forged in you a new strength, not the fragile kind that hides behind perfection, but the kind of holy resilience that only comes from walking through hell with your faith intact. For the first time in years, you began to hear your own voice again, no longer filtered through someone else's opinion, no longer twisted by shame, no longer quieted by fear. You began to pray with power, not panic. You began to worship from a place of authority, not just desperation. You started to remember, that you are not an extension of someone else's broken identity. You are an image bearer of God, fearfully and wonderfully made, called, set apart, and filled with the same Spirit that raised Christ from the dead. This is the beauty of divine separation. It doesn't just break bonds, it restores identity. It doesn't just expose lies, it awakens truth. And the truth is, you were never the weak one. You were never the problem. You were the target precisely because of how strong, radiant, and spiritually sensitive you were. The narcissists saw it. They envied it. They tried to possess it. But what is God-given cannot be stolen. It can only be surrendered. And now, through the intervention of the Most High, you have taken it back. And what does the narcissist see now? A soul they cannot reach, a light they cannot dim, a strength they can no longer exploit. You are no longer orbiting their chaos. You are walking in alignment with the Creator of the universe, and your peace, your radiant, quiet, Spirit-filled peace, is louder than any scream they can muster. It is the undeniable evidence that their hold is broken, their power is revoked, and their narrative no longer governs your reality. But God doesn't stop there. He doesn't just restore what was lost, He redefines what's possible. Where trauma once lived, purpose now breathes. Where confusion once lingered, clarity now reigns. You begin to speak with wisdom that only survivors carry. You walk with grace that only the refined understand. And you no longer need to explain your worth, you embody it. You are not simply healed, you are crowned. You are not just delivered, you are commissioned. The oil of heaven is on your life, not in spite of the separation, but because of it. That is the ultimate reversal. That what the enemy meant to use for evil, God has woven into victory. And as Scripture declares in Isaiah 61:3, He gives you beauty for ashes, the oil of joy for mourning, the garment of praise for the spirit of despair. Now the story is no longer about what they did to you, the story is about what God has done in you. You are living proof that when God separates, He elevates. When He removes, He restores. When He breaks a soul tie, He doesn't leave you in the wilderness, He brings you into promise. So walk forward, not as a survivor who barely escaped, but as a conqueror who was chosen to rise. Walk forward, not carrying their residue, but wearing heaven's robe. You are no longer a prisoner to their ego. You are a witness to God's justice. You are no longer defined by what broke you. Let the world wonder how you survived. Let the narcissist fumble for a new source of supply. Let the silence speak louder than revenge. Because what God has done in you is irreversible. Their ego shattered, but your spirit was made whole. You were not abandoned, you were chosen. When God separated you, it may have felt like abandonment. The silence, the pain, the nights you cried out and heard no answer. But now, standing at the end of this long and winding path, you can see clearly it wasn't abandonment at all. It was election. It was divine selection. You were not discarded. You were chosen for restoration. You were not torn apart. You were set apart. The narcissist did not lose just anyone. They lost someone heaven defended. They lost someone whose value was never theirs to define. And in trying to break you, they uncovered the immovable truth that your identity was never theirs to own. It belonged to God. And God, in His perfect timing, reached down and said, "This one is mine, and no more will they be used." You may still carry the memories, you may still feel the weight of the years you gave, but look again. See what God has built from the ashes. See the strength in your spirit, the fire in your voice, the steadiness in your eyes. What once was a victim is now a vessel. What once was wounded is now wise. What once was silent is now unshakable. This is what divine separation was always meant to do, not just to deliver you from evil, but to deliver you into purpose. So let the narcissists cling to the ruins of their illusions. Let them wrestle with the ego they worshipped. That is no longer your burden to carry. You are not defined by what they did. You are defined by the God who brought you out, the one who watched over you, grieved with you. And if you've walked through this valley, if you've seen the mask fall, the ego crack, and the judgment unfold, know this: your healing is not quiet in heaven. It resounds through the halls of eternity. It is the sound of chains breaking, of injustice answered, of heaven's justice flowing like a river. It is the sound of one life restored to truth, and in that one life, generations can be changed. God did not forget you, He rescued you. And the evidence is not only that you survived, but that you are now rising. So walk forward, not as one who was left behind, but as one who was set free. Let the past remain in God's hands, where justice belongs. Let the future remain in His promises, where hope endures. And let your present be the altar where gratitude meets glory, where scars become songs, and where every step forward testifies, God separated me, and now I live.